I don't think it'd be a bold statement to say that Pardo is the most confusing character in this game. Most people might argue that Richard is a little bit more confusing than him. But even this guy has a tough time figuring Pardo out. Never fear though, because I think we might have had a breakthrough in Pardo's story that changes many things we understood about the second game. So join us as we decode Pardo's plea. Let's start with where the mysteries began. We know Pardo is investigating a murder done by someone dubbed the Miami Mutilator. As we progress through the game, we discover the many murders done at the hands of the serial killer, and details emerge that suggest that these mutilations are done by Pardo himself, presumably trying to leave a infamous legacy behind. That, or he's trying to solve his own murders and become famous. A theory like that one though, if applied to the story as we know it, would imply that something went wrong. But we'll get back to that. Among the other ambitions behind these murders is the possibility that he's being forced into doing them. One of the more interesting parts of these mutilations are the messages written in the victim's blood. Pardo seems to be saying here that he's not in control of his actions and is being forced to do these killings. I'm gonna be honest with you though. This makes zero sense! Pardo has no problem killing in cold blood. He's exceptionally good at it, in fact. Someone who is desperate to not kill innocent people wouldn't repeatedly put himself in the position to kill people at all. And also, who's forcing this guy to do anything? I think it's more possible that he writes these messages to make his murders more interesting for the press, but when he... Oh my fuck. Many of you have likely watched Squatch Gaming's explanation of the Miami Mutilator. He comes to the conclusion that the puppet
is the murderous entity within him that forces him to commit the Miami Mutilator killings. He pushes the puppet off, and as its head shatters on the floor, Pardo realizes that his time has come to an end. At his most recent killing, he left behind physical evidence, bullet casings that can be tracked to his gun.
Hold up. What did you say?
Bullet casings that can be tracked to his gun.
Okay. How many of you have played Battlefield before? Okay. What's missing here? Go! Did you say nothing? Congratulations, you're right! Nothing is missing here. In fact, everything here is correct, which means everything in the scene is fucked. Here's the problem. Anyone that knows how bullet casings exit revolvers knows that they aren't projected out in an M1911. They leave like this. So how did Pardo's revolver emit a bullet casing? Easy! It didn't. That's not his, and...
Actually, that was a misinput and oversight, if you will. Dennaton must have mistakenly made the revolver emit the casing to make the story conclusive without considering how a revolver works. Also, I like fat-free art.
I think you're wrong, Pyrocritical. In fact, I believe...
It's true, I really like fat-free art.
No, I believe that part. Here's the thing. In every other part of the game, the revolver doesn't emit a single bullet casing. Every part except one. And I think there's a reason why Dennaton made a bullet casing leave in this specific scene. During a bad trip on Sun's drug. You'd have to be high to believe it. With this in mind, we know that no shots were fired from Pardo's revolver, but I'm also pretty sure that Pardo didn't have some desire to become infamous as well. This dream is a nightmare. This is not something he wanted to happen. So let me make this clear. He's not worried about laying around out here, because this isn't his. And it's unlikely that he put this bullet here on purpose. At least that's what this dream seems to indicate. He's worried about something else. And I believe it has very little to do with his revolver. But perhaps this casing can help us find out what that is. So whose bullet is it? We can try and find out by looking at the people who are associated with Pardo. Only a few come to mind. Starting with Evan Wright. We know Evan knows of some misbehavior on Pardo's part, and it doesn't even seem like they're really friends. It looks like Evan really only associates with Pardo because it gets him easy access to police reports and evidence, which are useful resources for his book. But, this isn't a one-sided partnership. Apparently Evan had to help Pardo with something to get those favors. One of those favors brings us to his next connection actually. Petrov, a Russian mobster. A fairly strange connection for a police officer to have. Fuck, scroll down you bitch. Strangely enough, it doesn't seem like his underlings got the memo. That's besides the point. Well, for now anyway. Why does Pardo have a connection with this guy? No clue. Anyway, the chief. Not much information is known about him. Pardo seems convinced that the chief will cover for his misconduct. To a point. And finally, Sun. What do you know? Another Russian connection. Pardo only has a brief tie-in with Sun. Often overlooked and dismissed, he tries to speak to him for an unknown reason, but either this lackey also didn't get the memo that Pardo and the Russian leaders are on speaking terms, or something else is going on because he also prevents Pardo from utilizing this connection. Something tells me this isn't a coincidence. With these characters in mind, I'd like to share some of my findings pertaining to each one, and hopefully we can move on from there and find out who this bullet casing belongs to. Let's start with the chief. Here's what I found. This is all a dream. It's important to know that what we know about Chief is limited, as much of what I can say about him is based on Pardo's experience with him. Most of what we can infer about him in relation to Pardo is actually based on the dream Pardo has about his day of reckoning. Just like all the other dreams in the game, it's essential to know that not all of this accurately portrays aspects of reality. On that note, I don't believe many parts of Pardo's dream represents what he's worried about. For example, his revolver. We know he never loses his revolver at the crime scene. It's likely that every part concerning his revolver was just a random narrative device induced by his dream that aided in the delivery of what Pardo was actually worried about. Chief thinks the witness is suspicious. Throughout the game, there are many awkward or strange pauses that indicate that we can interpret some sort of alternate meaning of what someone is saying, or in some cases, in what they are not saying. Chief briefly pauses after talking about a witness to Pardo's crimes. This brief pause tells us that Pardo knows the Chief is smart enough to see some holes in what the witness is saying, but Chief will nonetheless have Pardo detained, likely due to the amount of pressure on the Chief, as well as the amount of stress he's dealing with due to Jacket's trial. Pardo's movie. This is a dream about a movie being made about him. The way he lets out cheesy one-liners while fantasizing about the presence of a film crew indicates that there's some desire of a movie being made about him. If you watch Squatch Gaming's Chronology, you probably heard him say,
He begins to fantasize about what'll happen to him, and it plays out in his head like a movie.
No. This is not a fantasy. This is a nightmare. You'll notice that his demeanor in his dream while speaking to the Chief is in stark contrast to how he acts when he's fantasizing about the film crew. The fact that this is a nightmare is further indicated by how he reacts when he wakes up, and at the end of the game. Here's what I think is going on here. I think he was hoping to get famous for figuring out the Miami Mutilator, but something subverts his plans, and he dreams about a different movie being made about him. One that will subvert details in order to paint Pardo as a villain. Kinda like how Midnight Animal skews details about Jacket to make him look like a bigger monster than he is, even straight up lying about him, and making him out to be like a predator, the kind that, I can't say on YouTube. In this regard, he worries that if any film is made about him, they'll claim that these bullet casings left at the scene came from his gun, even though in reality, there's no way for that to happen. They'll call his collaborators witnesses, when in reality, they're just as guilty as him, but we're getting off scot-free. His only saving grace is to out the person who is really doing the killings, by pretending he was set up by the person helping him, who was actually the one who left that bullet casing there. This is why he asked to be let free in order to prove he was framed. The Chief ultimately won't allow it, even though he does know there's something weird going on. His plans to be a hero in a film were completely foiled, and his worst nightmare happened. He would be remembered as a villain. But that's not all. The people who were trying to investigate these new maps. Moving on to Evan. The first thing I'd like to point out about this character is that he's not innocent. Not even close. You see, the second game frames Evan in a favorable light, showing his regret as he kills a Russian, showing he cares about his family, and even as we play the game, we're given the option to simply injure enemies as opposed to killing them. This has misled people into thinking Evan is one of the more innocent characters in this series. There's a lot of misleading things in regards to Evan. The only playable character that really gets the innocent title is ironically the character who kills Jacket's girlfriend. Oh, and Beard, almost forgot about him. Some of you are probably wondering how such a selfless guy, even willing to donate some of his money to a homeless person, and out of the little money he has can be such an evil, pathological piece of human garbage. Well, you just don't know what he's done. Don't worry, I'll tell you. Speaking of this scene, Richard even says that the money he hands out is dirty money. That's your first hint. The second hint is found in Pardo's dream, where a witness of his crimes has come forward. Going to the next room, we see Evan. Look, I feel like this is fairly obvious. Evan knew who the Miami Mutilator was. Kinda. They practically tell us that he does in first trial, but that is the least interesting part. If he of all people was a witness, and if his nervous demeanor is of any indication, he likely had some sort of active role in the Miami Mutilator, but really only does it for the favors. He nonetheless is slightly regretful of these occurrences, hence why he prefers taking a bus instead of getting a ride with Pardo. He worries he'll end up being roped into whatever shenanigans that Pardo is getting into. But something tells me that's not it. Don't get me wrong, he has very likely been a witness to what Pardo is doing, but I see very little evidence of him partaking in the killings of these people. He still has blood on his hands though. I'd like to bring your attention to Evan's conversation with Richter. Richter is willing to tell him everything he's experienced as one of the mass maniacs. The phone calls, the threats, the killings, his escape, and even where he escaped to. And all he wanted in return was a plane ticket to Hawaii for his mom. Oh, and Evan agreed to get it for her. I'm gonna need you guys to forgive me for this upcoming bit. This isn't an endorsement or whatever, but you're really going to spend money on a plane ticket for this guy? Evan, you're broke! You're fucking poor! You barely got enough money for rents. You can barely afford to give this hobo $3, and you're gonna really buy a plane ticket for this guy? Where are you getting the money? Oh no. The final favor. Many of us are under the misconception that there were no more favors after Pardo let Evan into that evidence storage locker. They both say no more favors after all, but this is definitely not the case. How else could he have afforded that plane ticket? He likely asked Pardo for some cash, but Pardo wanted something in return. And here he is, wearing a police outfit, here and here. I previously believed this was the first favor, because, it felt so free. Since Martin's sequences are undated, this could have easily occurred before homicide. But with Evan wearing this outfit after the events of Death Wish, it's very unlikely that this was the first favor. This raises a very concerning question. Why is Midnight Anna up next? Petrov. He couldn't get operatives to talk. In his meeting with Evan, he mentions that he caught many operatives working for 50 Blessings, but he couldn't get them to talk. But here's the thing. The police could though. When Jacket collects police reports after his talk with Richter, he reads them when he gets home, and they say that suspects claim to have been threatened into, instructed to kill by messages on there, phone calls traced to a club on South 86th Street, ties to underground Russian mafia network, multiple accounts of illegal activity reported, insufficient evidence for a warrant. Hilarious, by the way, that that's insufficient evidence. The police could get the suspects to talk, but the Russians couldn't? Even after torture? Petrov's lackey versus Pardo. It seems that this Russian mobster isn't interested in letting Evan talk to Petrov. Pardo seems to have insisted that telling him that he sent Evan would have granted him that meeting, hinting that they are partnered to some capacity, but it didn't work. Either this lackey didn't believe him, or Pardo's connection with Petrov has withered. I'm gonna guess the latter, since Petrov seems to believe that Pardo isn't a good friend. And while he likely said that due to him sending Evan over there, I believe this is also a reflection about how he feels about him, even prior to this meeting. A look into his main henchman. I was going to share a little bit about his main henchman in this segment, but then I realized that not much is known about him. He's really only shown to be present with Petrov during Jake's death, then he's killed by Evan. That's it. Son. Pardo doing his dirty work. And dead ahead, he's seen going after the Colombians alone. But why would he do that? It's possible that he wanted to end the gang war between the Russians and the Colombians, so they stopped making headlines and therefore stealing the spotlight from the Miami Mutilator. But then why would he side with the weaker faction? The Russian organization was essentially destroyed after Jack had killed Father in the first game. They have far less people than the Colombians and less power. So why didn't Pardo go after the Russians instead? Is it possible that there's connections between Pardo and the Russians? If so, they had me fooled. Son's lackey versus Pardo. Unlike Petrov, we don't see Son's main lackey interact with Pardo. Technically, Blue Lips here is his replacement. He, on the other hand, does have an interaction with Pardo. But just like Evan's interaction with Petrov's henchman, Pardo is prevented from seeing Son by Blue Lips. Something is going on here. This can't be a coincidence. A look into Son's henchman. Unlike Petrov, we do get a little bit more out of Son's main henchman, and I think there's one particular part that is incredibly interesting. After his girl robs him of his money and car, we see him go and try and call Son. But Son misses his call and Wait, what? Oh, you're right. If you watched Chronology, you probably went along with the assumption that henchman tries to call Mary. This is not the case. The whole scenario was odd, and I said this in my first video, but what kind of automatic message tells you that you called the wrong number? This is a very weird automatic message, since surprise, machines have no way of knowing you called the wrong number, or whether or not you intentionally called a specific number. Consumer phones don't typically have an automatic message like this either. I'm willing to bet no phone does. So I doubt this is Mary. We're hinted at this being an attempt to call Son during Henchman's dream. He's driving a nice car with the money flowing out. After the money disappears, Son is wearing a Richard mask in the back seat. He says that people without direction end up going in circles, and as Squatch Gaming said,
ending up back where they started.
This scene tells us that Henchman is worried that in his attempt to live like his boss, he's eventually going to spend all of his money. When his money runs out, he will return to Son and work for him again. He had no clue that he'd be out of money way sooner than he thought. What conclusions can we draw by looking at these connections? How about a police and Russian partnership in 1989? There's plenty of evidence that suggests that this is the case, starting with the fact that Pardo is connected with these guys to begin with. Pardo likely didn't just stumble into this connection. He probably watched the Russian influence take hold in his department and embraced it. Next, we have a similarity in belief across the police and the Russians. In 1989, Jacket reads a newspaper that says the police don't think this is a group of vigilantes, reflected by Petrov's belief. When you play as Jake, we also see that the Russians are trying to influence the news, likely their way of getting the word out that they aren't vigilantes, possibly hoping that this will expedite the discovery process of who's behind all these killings. There are some events that seem to debunk the notion that there was a Russian influence on the police, like the SWAT killing some Russians and the fact that the Russians and the police have different stories about getting info on 50 Blessing operatives. But it's important to know that SWAT and police are separate departments in certain larger cities, Miami being one of them. It seems that 50 Blessings infiltrated the SWAT, while the Russians infiltrated Miami PD. With this said, it's apparent that this connection was eroded when their organization was destroyed. They managed to keep a connection with Pardo, but that wouldn't be enough to bring back their former prestige. It seems to me, though, that he found someone that could help him. Do you remember that automatic message? The one where I said, consumer phones don't typically have an automatic message like this either. I'm willing to bet no phone does. Well, about that. There actually is one.
We are 50 blessings together. March into the future. You have reached a wrong number.
It ends the same way as it does on Henchman's call to Sun. Could it be that Sun has a mock-up of a 50 Blessings automatic message? Or maybe the Russian organization does. But why? Why am I pretending like I don't know? Here's the guy responsible. Wait. Is that Evan? Oh shit, my bad. Let me fix that real quick. He kind of looks like him. Yep, that's right. The 50 Blessings operative guarded by Russians. The reason the Russians have all these phones. And the person they confused Evans for. Here's what happened. After the Russian mafia crumbled and the Colombians took everything, Sun, wanting to make his late father proud, looked for a way to topple the Colombians. And what likely happened is that the technician noticed that he had lost his protection by Russians after their organization crumbled. He went to look for Sun so he could be protected on the off chance that another Charlie came after him. Sun realized that while the technician didn't know who did this to his organization, he knew how they did it, and would attempt to recreate it, knowing it would help him beat the Colombians. You might have noticed that many of his levels have red backdrops, typically associated with dreams or alternate reality. Something tells me that Richard was onto something when he said, "He's not here, and neither are you." I think he sent his own set of masked operatives, highly trained special forces soldiers, ironically Russian-hating veterans who, unbeknownst to them, were sent to do Sun's dirty work in the guise of a 50 Blessings mission. And if you don't believe me, I think you will after this. Moving up was supposedly the mission that ended up getting the fans a little bit of notoriety in the press. This notoriety is discussed on December 9th. It was covered by the news the previous day, one day after a certain event. On December 7th, Sun robbed a bank on the same day that Richard said he wasn't there. The news talked about masked individuals one day after that heist. Why would they be talking about something that occurred over a week ago? They have to be talking about the heist. Strangely enough, the fans say that they were the ones that were on TV. You starting to see what I'm trying to say here? There are a total of 50 of these veterans who were previously a part of D Company. I call them 50 Omens, and I can only speculate that this is their given name, with all the demonic and occultish imagery that comes with it. But that's not all. Pardo is seen attacking the Colombians alone, and on the hardest mission in the second game. Something tells me that poor Jack wasn't killed by Pardo. He was dropped off and killed by someone else. If I were to guess, he has a deal with Sun where he will deal with the Colombians as long as Sun does the dirty, bloody work. Look at what the puppet says. We're related by blood. You can think of me as your son. He had no clue that Sun wasn't doing the killings himself. And I'm gonna say it, this guy isn't a figment of Pardo's psyche. He is one of Sun's puppets, dubbed by Pardo the Miami Mutilator. These pleas aren't Pardo's. They are his. Pardo possibly walked into this operative while he was doing his work, and the operative assumed that he was the one sending the calls and attacked him. But the trained Pardo has had tougher battles. He is still fighting a trained army veteran who managed to take down Pardo and choke him. Pardo reaches for the vet's gun and shoots him in the head. Pardo then disposes of the veteran's gun, but left the casing. He's not worried about it though, as it can't be traced to his revolver. Pardo has nightmares about it for days, because as he was choked, he left fingerprints at the scene. But he's not even worried about that, or about the police, or about the Russians. Sun's dead after all. He realized he interfered with the plans of the actual villain of Hotline Miami 2, one who delivers harsh consequences to those that fail him, or get in his way. He had no way of predicting that his first favor from Evan would backfire on him. They said it'd take 5 years. They got the number wrong. by 2 years. Thanks for watching this video. If you could do me a favor and like it, and maybe check out my Twitter. And yeah, we post some cool stuff on there. And if you want to follow my Twitch as well, I have 1 follower. Thanks to that guy who actually listened to my post and followed me. I love that guy. And I'll love you too if you follow me. It's probably gonna take me a little bit to like start streaming there because Rec Central Express does not work on my 2012 iMac. So yeah, we're gonna have to go with Elgato. And but go ahead and follow that. That'd be cool. Oh, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much.